I never thought my life choices would become the centerpiece of a family interrogation. I'm 37, financially independent, and happy. But none of that seems to matter when I step into a family gathering. Only thing that does? The fact that I don't have children. It was my mother's idea to have a big family dinner. My parents, my younger sister Rachel and her husband, my older brother Mark with his wife and their 3 kids, a couple of aunts and uncles, and my grandmother. A full house, loud conversations, clinking silverware, and the smell of roasted turkey. I was in the kitchen helping my mom slice vegetables when she started. You know, Sarah, you're not getting any younger. Have you ever considered freezing your eggs? I sighed. Mom, I'm happy with my life. I have my job, my friends. But no family, she cut in. You're alone, sweetheart. What happens when you're old? Who will take care of you? I forced a smile, unwilling to ruin the night this early. I'll take care of myself like I always have. She shook her head, disappointed but not ready to press further. Yet, at dinner, I was seated between Rachel and Aunt Linda, who was known for her blunt opinions. It didn't take long before the conversation shifted to kids, Rachel's toddler throwing tantrums, Mark's eldest making the soccer team. I listened, nodded, sipped my wine. And then it came. Sarah, Aunt Linda said, turning to me. Don't you want this? A family of your own. I gave her the same answer I'd given for years. I love my life the way it is. Kids just aren't for me. A pause. A silence heavier than it needed to be. Then, my father cleared his throat. That's selfish. I looked up stunned. Excuse me. You only think about yourself, he continued. You have a good job, a nice apartment, but what is all of that worth if you have no one to share it with? Mark, who usually stayed neutral, joined in. You don't understand now, but one day you will. Life isn't about working yourself to death. It's about family. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of how predictable it was. My life isn't empty just because I don't have children. I have a career I love. I travel. I have friends. That's enough for me. Rachel scoffed. Friends aren't family, Sarah. Friends won't be there when you're old and sick. I turned to her, my own sister, who had always been the golden child, the one who followed every tradition, married at 25, had her first child at 27, and never missed a Sunday church service. So my life only has meaning if I have kids? It has purpose. My grandmother spoke up, her frail voice slicing through the room. A woman's purpose is to be a mother. That's how it has always been. The weight of their words pressed down on me, the expectation, the judgment. I had heard variations of this my entire life, but never this directly, never this aggressively. Aunt Linda leaned in, voice hushed but firm. Sarah, darling, no one is saying your career isn't impressive, but it's not the same as leaving a legacy. Your mother, your grandmother, they dedicated their lives to raising children. And look at us now, sitting here together as a family. That's what matters. I gritted my teeth. My legacy isn't tied to motherhood. It's tied to the impact I make in my own way. Rachel sighed dramatically, looking at Mark as if I were a lost cause. My father just shook his head. My mother, eyes full of unspoken disappointment, poked at her mashed potatoes. Then the real blow came. You'll regret it, Mark said, his voice softer now, almost pitying. And when you do, it'll be too late. Something inside me snapped. I put down my fork, my appetite gone. You know what? Maybe I will. Or maybe I won't. But what I won't do is have a child just to fit into your expectations of what my life should be. I'm happy. Can any of you say the same? Silence. Rachel's husband coughed. One of Mark's kids squirmed in their seat. My grandmother muttered something under her breath. I stood up. I don't need to justify my life to any of you. I grabbed my coat and walked out. No one followed. For the first time in a long time, I realized something. I wasn't the one missing out. They were. I was still reeling from the last family dinner. The arguments, the judgment, the disappointment in my mother's eyes, it all sat heavy in my chest. But what bothered me the most was how quickly they dismissed me, as if my life held no value without children. I had sworn I wouldn't put myself through another night like that anytime soon. Yet here I was. My mother had called, her voice dripping with forced cheerfulness. We're having a small lunch this Sunday, just family. It would mean a lot if you came. I hesitated. I wanted to say no to remind her how the last gathering went, but something in her tone made me pause. She wasn't pushing me about kids this time. It almost sounded sad. So, against my better judgment, I agreed. I arrived at their house with my usual emotional armor on, prepared for the usual passive-aggressive remarks and forced smiles. My father barely acknowledged me as he read his newspaper. My sister Rachel greeted me with a polite nod, while my brother Mark gave me the same condescending look he always did, the one that said, "Poor Sarah, doesn't know what she's missing." The conversation was light at first. Talk about the weather, Mark's latest work project, Rachel's kids. I mostly sat in silence, sipping my iced tea, waiting for the inevitable moment when someone would try to drag me into another discussion about my so-called failures. But then something shifted. A name I hadn't heard in years slipped into the conversation. Ashley called last week, my mother said, her voice uneasy. I almost choked on my drink. Ashley, my younger sister, the one no one ever talked about anymore. Rachel scoffed. Let me guess. She was asking for money again. My father grunted. Of course she was. I frowned. Ashley called? And no one told me. Mark rolled his eyes. Why would we? She's a lost cause, Sarah. I ignored him and turned to my mother. What did she say? Mom hesitated before sighing. She wanted to see if we could help her with rent. And we told her no, my father said flatly. I set my glass down, my appetite gone. She's still my sister. How is she? Rachel let out a bitter laugh. How do you think? Same as always. Messed up. Can't hold a job. Probably using again. I felt a pang in my chest. Ashley had always been the wild one, the rebel. While I was focused on my education and career, she was getting high in our parents' basement. When I left home, I distanced myself from her drama. But I had still loved her. And now they were talking about her like she was nothing. She had a kid, you know, Mark said suddenly, picking up a piece of bread and tearing it apart. I blinked. What? They all exchanged glances, as if they had just realized I didn't know. Mom shifted uncomfortably. A boy. Oliver. He's 10 now. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Ashley has a son? And no one thought to tell me. Mark sighed. It's not like it mattered. She lost him years ago. I gripped the edge of the table. Lost him? What do you mean? Rachel waved a hand dismissively. Child Protective Services took him. She was in and out of rehab, and they decided she wasn't fit to raise him. Last we heard, he was placed in foster care. I stared at them in disbelief. And none of you cared to do anything? My father's expression hardened. It wasn't our problem, Sarah. She made her choices. He's a child. My voice rose, my heart pounding. He's your grandson. My nephew. And you just let him disappear into the system. Rachel gave me a pointed look. What did you expect us to do? Take him in? We have our own families to worry about. I turned to my mother, pleading. Mom, you just let this happen? She looked down at her plate. We couldn't handle another mess, Sarah. It was better this way. I felt sick. Oliver. My nephew. A boy I had never met. Abandoned by the very people who should have fought for him. And they sat here, eating their lunch, acting like it was just another unfortunate inconvenience. I can't believe you, I whispered, pushing my chair back. Rachel sighed. Oh, don't be so dramatic. I ignored her, grabbing my coat. Mark shook his head. You always think you know better, Sarah. But trust me, that kid is probably better off where he is. I paused at the door, my blood boiling. You're all disgusting. Then I walked out, slamming the door behind me. For the first time in a long time, I had a purpose. I was going to find Oliver. I spent the next 2 weeks doing something my family never bothered to do, finding my nephew. At first, I had no idea where to start. Ashley had been out of my life for so long that I barely knew where she had lived last, let alone where her son had ended up. I made calls, searched records, and even reached out to an old friend who worked in social services. That led me to a name, Brightwood Children's Home. It was a small foster care facility on the outskirts of town, housing children whose futures were uncertain. Kids waiting for adoption, waiting for their parents to get clean, waiting for something. Anything better than what they had. And Oliver was one of them. I didn't tell my family what I was doing. I already knew what their reaction would be. They had made it clear at that awful lunch that they had written him off, just like they had written Ashley off. But I couldn't stop thinking about him. A 10-year-old boy, alone in the system, abandoned by the people who were supposed to love him. I wasn't going to be one of them. The first time I stepped into Brightwood, I felt like an outsider intruding on something fragile. The place wasn't terrible. Worn-out couches in the lobby, shelves filled with donated books, walls decorated with drawings and handprints. It was clean, but it wasn't a home. A woman in her 50s, Mrs. Callahan, met me at the front desk. She was the kind of person who had seen too much, lines of exhaustion on her face but warmth in her voice. You're here for Oliver? She asked, flipping through some papers. I nodded. I'm his aunt. She gave me a long, searching look before motioning for me to follow her down a hallway. Oliver is complicated. Complicated how? She sighed. He's been moved around a lot. 7 homes in 4 years. Some placements were temporary, some just didn't work out. I swallowed hard. Why? Trust issues. Behavioral problems. She hesitated. And, well, he's used to people leaving. I felt something tighten in my chest. She stopped in front of a door and knocked before pushing it open. Inside, a small boy sat at a desk, hunched over a piece of paper. He didn't look up. His hair was dark and too long, his clothes a little too big for his thin frame. His small hands gripped a colored pencil as he sketched furiously. Oliver, Mrs. Callahan said, her voice gentle. This is Sarah. She's your aunt. The pencil stopped moving. Slowly, Oliver turned his head and stared at me. His eyes were sharp, suspicious, too old for his face. He said nothing. I took a step forward, trying to ignore the way my heart pounded. Hey, Oliver. He didn't answer. He just watched me, as if waiting for me to prove that I was just another person who would walk away. I glanced at his drawing. It was detailed, far too detailed for a 10-year-old. A cityscape, dark clouds hanging over the buildings, tiny figures in the streets. It was beautiful and a little unsettling. You're really talented, I said. Still, no response. Mrs. Callahan sighed. He might take some time to warm up. I'll give you 2 a few minutes. She stepped out, leaving us alone. I sat in the chair across from him. Do you like drawing? Oliver finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. It's better than talking. I smiled a little. Fair enough. For a few moments, he kept drawing, ignoring me. I let the silence settle, watching him work. Then cautiously I asked, "Do you know who I am?" He nodded, not looking up. "Mom talked about you. A long time ago." I wasn't sure what that meant, but I asked anyway. "What did she say?" He shrugged. "That you were different from the rest of them." Something about the way he said it made my throat tighten. I cleared my throat. "Well, I'd like to get to know you." Oliver finally looked up again. His expression was blank, but his eyes searched mine. "Why?" I exhaled. "Because you're my family." For a second, just a second, something flickered in his gaze. Hope? No, it was too soon for that. More like doubt. Like he wanted to believe me but knew better. He turned back to his drawing. They all say that. They all say that. How many times had he been promised things by people who never meant it? How many times had he been told he was family, only to be dropped the second things got hard? I clenched my fists under the table. "I'm not like them," I said firmly. Oliver didn't answer. But for the first time, his grip on the pencil loosened just a little. That night, I made the mistake of answering Rachel's call. "Mom says you've been asking around about Ashley's kid," she said, her voice dripping with disapproval. I rolled my eyes. "His name is Oliver." Rachel sighed. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing?" "I'm trying to help him." "Why?" she snapped. "What do you even know about raising a child?" I gritted my teeth. "I'm not saying I'm taking him home tomorrow, Rachel. But someone has to care." She let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, so now you're playing hero? What, feeling guilty because you never wanted kids? So you're trying to prove something?" I felt my hands shake with anger. "This has nothing to do with me not wanting children. This is about him. He's been passed around like he's disposable, and none of you even care." Rachel scoffed. "And you think you'll be different? Face it, Sarah. You don't have what it takes for this. You're a workaholic. You like your quiet little life. This isn't some charity project. He's not a stray puppy you can fix." "I never said he was broken," I shot back. "But it's disgusting that you all left him behind." Silence. Then she muttered, "Mom's upset about this." "Good." I snapped and hung up. I sat in my apartment for a long time after that, staring at the floor. Rachel was wrong. This wasn't about proving anything. This was about a 10-year-old boy who had no one. And I wasn't going to let that stay true. I had never thought of myself as a mother, never pictured myself raising a child, guiding them through life, or being responsible for someone else's future, but Oliver changed everything. Every visit to Brightwood, every quiet moment spent watching him sketch in his worn-out notebook, every hesitant glance he gave me made it clearer I couldn't walk away from him. I wouldn't. At first, my visits were short, just an hour or two at a time, and he rarely spoke beyond a few words. He preferred drawing to conversation, and I didn't push him. I brought him supplies, better pencils, higher quality paper, and eventually a real sketchbook. The day I gave it to him, he didn't say thank you, didn't react the way most kids would when receiving a gift, but he held onto it like it was something precious, running his fingers over the smooth pages before carefully setting it aside. The next time I visited, he was already halfway through filling it. It wasn't just talent. His drawings had a depth and emotion that most 10-year-olds couldn't capture. His work was detailed, realistic, and often dark. He drew cities covered in storm clouds, houses with no lights on, empty roads stretching into nowhere. But then once I saw something different. A small drawing, almost hidden in the corner of a page, of two figures sitting together on a couch. A woman and a boy. The woman had long dark hair like mine. The boy had messy curls like his. He hadn't shown it to me, but I saw it. And it made my decision even stronger. I was going to adopt him. I didn't tell my family. I didn't need their input or their approval, and after the way they dismissed him, I knew they wouldn't support me. But somehow, they found out anyway. Rachel called me first furious, demanding to know if it was true. When I told her it was, she laughed in disbelief and asked me what the hell I thought I was doing, as if the idea of me taking in a child was completely absurd. I told her I didn't care what she thought, that Oliver needed someone, and that I was stepping up. She let out a bitter scoff before telling me that Mom and Dad were already working to stop me. I didn't believe her at first. I thought she was exaggerating, being dramatic just to get under my skin. But later that night, I checked my email and saw a forwarded copy of the letter my parents had sent to the court. They told them I was emotionally unfit to raise a child, that I had never wanted kids, that I was cold and distant, that my work was my priority, and that I didn't have the temperament to care for a vulnerable child. Reading it felt like being punched in the stomach. Not because it was true, but because my own parents had written it. Because they truly believed it. I called Laura, my best friend since college, the second I could form words. She didn't hesitate for a second before telling me that we were going to fight this. She was a lawyer, not an adoption lawyer, but she knew the system well enough to help. She connected me with Daniel Reed, a specialist in single-parent adoptions, and when I met with him, he didn't sugarcoat things. He told me that my parents' letter would hold weight in court, that family character references carried influence, and that it would be an uphill battle. But he also told me that it wasn't impossible. I threw myself into proving them wrong. I took parenting courses even though no one required me to. I met with social workers who evaluated my home, my finances, my emotional stability. I gathered letters from friends, colleagues, and even former teachers, people who had known me for years and could speak to my character. And through it all, I kept visiting Oliver. I didn't tell him what was happening. I didn't want to give him false hope, didn't want to make promises I might not be able to keep, but he started to notice something was different. He started to trust me. He stopped flinching when I reached for something near him. He let me see his sketches without hesitation. He even laughed once. It was quiet, just a soft chuckle under his breath when I told a bad joke, but it was real. One afternoon, I found him sitting on his bed, sketchbook in his lap, looking nervous. When I asked him what was wrong, he hesitated before slowly turning the book toward me. On the page was another drawing of two people, a woman and a boy sitting together, the same as before, but this time there was color. The woman's hair was dark brown. The boy's eyes were green. It was unmistakably us. My throat tightened as I asked him if that was what he wanted, if he was thinking about what it would be like. He nodded but looked away, embarrassed, and when I told him I was thinking about it too, he finally met my gaze. He asked me if they would let me, if the system would actually let me take him home, and I wished more than anything that I could have said yes. But I told him the truth. I didn't know. I was trying, but I didn't know. He stared at me for a long time, and then, for the first time since I met him, he smiled. It wasn't big, wasn't loud, just the tiniest curve of his lips. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The next day, I got a call from my lawyer. He told me the court was reviewing my case, that there was pushback from social services, but that it wasn't coming from them. It was coming from my parents. They weren't done trying to stop me. I clenched my jaw, my entire body tense with rage, but I didn't let it shake me. I had come too far. I wasn't giving up now. A week later, I received a letter in the mail, an official document with the court stamp on it, informing me that I had been approved for the next step in the adoption process. It wasn't over yet, but it was a step forward. I held the paper in my hands, staring at the words, barely breathing. Then, without thinking, I grabbed my coat and headed straight for Brightwood. When I arrived, Oliver was in the common room, sketching on the floor, his back hunched over as he focused on the page. I called his name, and when he looked up, I saw it again. That flicker of hope, that hesitant belief that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally going to stay. I walked over and sat beside him, my heart pounding as I placed the letter in front of him. He frowned at it, confused, before picking it up and reading. I watched his eyes scan the words, watched the way his fingers tightened around the edges of the paper, and for a moment, he didn't react. Then slowly he looked at me, his voice barely above a whisper. This means, I can live with you. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. Not yet. But soon. For a long time he didn't say anything. Then, without warning, he lunged forward and wrapped his arms around me, clinging to me like I was the only solid thing in his world. I held him tightly, my own eyes burning with tears, and in that moment, I knew that no matter what my family did, no matter how much they fought me, I would fight harder. Because Oliver was mine. He always had been. And I wasn't going to let anyone take him away from me. When the judge finally ruled in my favor, granting me custody of Oliver, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: relief. Not excitement, not celebration, just a deep, exhausted relief that I had fought through every obstacle, every accusation, every piece of doubt thrown my way, and I had won. I had spent months proving I was fit to raise him, attending parenting evaluations, home inspections, psychological assessments, and standing in court defending myself against my own family. My parents had done everything they could to paint me as unstable, as selfish, as someone incapable of giving a child a real home. But they had failed. Now Oliver was mine. When I arrived at Brightwood Children's Home to pick him up, he was already waiting for me. His backpack slung over his shoulder, his sketchbook clutched tightly in one hand. He didn't say much, just gave me a nod and walked to the car without looking back. He had learned a long time ago not to get too attached to places. The drive home was quiet. Oliver stared out the window, his fingers tapping anxiously on his knee, his body tense like he was preparing for something to go wrong. I wanted to say something comforting, to reassure him that this was his home now, but I knew words weren't enough. He had heard promises before. He had seen them broken. He wouldn't believe me until he saw it for himself. When we arrived at my apartment, Oliver hesitated at the door, looking up at me with an unreadable expression before finally stepping inside. I had spent the past few weeks preparing his room. New bed, shelves, a desk, and even an easel with fresh paints. It wasn't extravagant, but it was his. For a moment, he just stood in the doorway, gripping his backpack like he expected someone to take it away from him. You can put your stuff wherever, I said, trying to sound casual, like this was just any normal situation. This is your space now. He walked in slowly, setting his bag down by the bed. His fingers brushed over the desk, then the bookshelf, and finally, he reached out and touched the easel. His back was to me, so I couldn't see his face, but I heard his voice, quiet and hesitant. I never had my own room before. I felt something tighten in my chest. Well, now you do. He didn't respond, but I saw the way his shoulders relaxed just slightly. That night, I decided to cook a special dinner to celebrate, which, in hindsight, was a terrible idea because I was an awful cook. I had survived on takeout and pre-made meals for years, and my idea of cooking was boiling pasta and dumping in sauce. But I wanted to do something for Oliver, so I insisted on making spaghetti and meatballs from scratch. It did not go well. The meatballs crumbled, the sauce burned, and the pasta stuck together in a giant starchy blob. At some point, The fire alarm started blaring, and Oliver just sat at the kitchen table, watching the disaster unfold with wide eyes. When I finally managed to turn off the alarm and set a plate of food in front of him, he just stared at it. Then he looked at me. Then back at the plate. "Is this safe to eat?" I groaned, burying my face in my hands. "Probably not." For a second, there was silence. Then, Oliver laughed. A real, genuine laugh that caught me completely off guard. I looked up and saw him grinning. Actually grinning. I smiled back relieved. "Well, I hope you like grilled cheese, because that's the only other thing I know how to make." That night, we ate grilled cheese and tomato soup on the couch while watching a movie. Oliver was stiff at first, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to relax. But slowly, he leaned back into the cushions, his body finally at ease. It was the first time I saw him look comfortable, like he actually believed this was real. But the real test came the next morning. I woke up early to make breakfast cereal because I wasn't about to risk another cooking disaster and knocked on Oliver's bedroom door. No answer. When I opened it, I saw his bed was empty. His bag was gone. His sketchbook was missing. Panic shot through me. I searched the apartment, calling his name, checking the hallways, the building entrance, even running outside to the street. But he was gone. My chest tightened with fear. Had he run away? Had I done something wrong? Had he decided he didn't want to stay? I was about to call the police when I spotted a small figure sitting on the steps behind the building, hunched over his sketchbook, completely lost in his drawing. I exhaled sharply, relief flooding through me. I walked over slowly, sitting down beside him without saying anything. After a moment, Oliver spoke, his voice quiet. I woke up and thought, maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they'd come and take me back. I swallowed hard. "No one's taking you back, Oliver." He didn't look at me, just kept sketching. "They always take me back." I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. Not this time. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then finally, he closed his sketchbook and looked up at me. "Okay." It was just one word, but it meant everything. Breaking ties with my family. The next few weeks were the best and worst of my life. Oliver slowly started settling in, opening up in small ways, asking for specific foods he liked, leaving his drawings on the fridge, sitting next to me when we watched TV instead of keeping his distance. But at the same time, my parents escalated their fight against me. After failing to block my custody, they refused to acknowledge Oliver's existence. They stopped calling. When I sent them a letter telling them they could meet him if they were willing to put aside their hatred, my mother sent back a single sentence. "You've made your choice. Don't expect forgiveness." Rachel, of course, made it worse. She showed up at my door one evening, demanding to know if I was happy now that I had ruined the family. She accused me of stealing a child out of guilt, of being selfish, of destroying everything for the sake of a charity case. I stood there in the doorway listening to her spew venom, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing for her. "I don't need your approval," I told her. "And I don't need this family's cruelty in my life. So if this is how you feel, don't come back." She left in a rage, but I didn't care. I had already made my decision. That night, as I sat on the couch, Oliver curled up beside me, sketching in his book. I realized something. I had lost a family, but I had gained a son. And I had never been more sure that I had made the right choice. The first few weeks of Oliver living with me felt like we were both adjusting to a world that neither of us fully understood yet, as if we had stepped into a life that felt both right and unfamiliar at the same time. There were small moments of progress, little victories that I held onto desperately, like the way he started leaving his sketches on the fridge instead of keeping them locked away in his notebook, or how he mumbled a barely audible goodnight before shutting his bedroom door at the end of the day. But there were also challenges, moments where the reality of what he had been through reared its head in ways I hadn't fully prepared for, moments that reminded me that this wasn't going to be easy, that love and stability alone wouldn't erase the years of uncertainty and neglect that had shaped him into the cautious, guarded child he had become. Discipline became an issue almost immediately, not because Oliver was deliberately disobedient in the way most kids tested boundaries, but because he had never really experienced the kind of structure that I was trying to provide for him. He had spent years in different foster homes, where the rules were either suffocatingly strict or completely absent, and he had learned to adapt by either fading into the background or fighting against authority in whatever way he could. The first time I asked him to clean up his room, he just stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language, waiting to see if I was actually serious, and when I repeated myself, he scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and walked away as if it wasn't worth his time to argue. It was the same with homework, with following basic house rules, with things as simple as letting me know when he was leaving the apartment. He wasn't defiant because he wanted to be difficult. He was testing me, waiting to see if I would eventually decide that he wasn't worth the effort, waiting to see if I would do what so many others had done before me and give up on him. One night, after I had called him out for lying about a missing homework assignment, he crossed his arms over his chest and glared at me with a sharpness that didn't belong on a child's face before snapping that it wasn't a big deal and that I only cared because I wanted him to be perfect, because I didn't want to regret taking him in. The words hit me harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because I knew that deep down, he genuinely believed them. He was terrified of disappointing me, of proving my family right, of being someone that no one wanted to keep. I took a breath, forcing myself to stay calm, and told him that I didn't care if he messed up, that I didn't care if he got things wrong or made mistakes or broke the rules sometimes, but that I did care about him and that I wasn't going anywhere. He didn't respond, didn't say anything at all, just turned away and disappeared into his room, and I let him go, knowing that no amount of words would convince him yet. The next morning, his homework was sitting on the kitchen counter, neatly completed, and though he never mentioned it, I knew it was his way of saying that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to believe me. School, however, was an entirely different battle, one that neither of us had been prepared for. Oliver had been placed in the 5th grade, and while he was undeniably intelligent, especially when it came to anything artistic, he struggled with structure in a way that made it difficult for him to stay engaged in class. His teacher, Ms. Lane, a no-nonsense woman in her late 40s who had clearly seen her fair share of difficult students, called me in for a meeting after the first month and told me plainly that Oliver was bright but distracted, stubborn, and unwilling to follow directions, that he spent more time sketching in the margins of his papers than actually completing his assignments, and that she was worried he wasn't adjusting well. I asked her what I could do, what steps I needed to take to help him, and she told me that what he needed most was consistency, that kids like Oliver, kids who had been through more than they should have at his age, needed to know that someone was keeping an eye on them, that they weren't just slipping through the cracks unnoticed. I was already determined to do that, but what I didn't realize was that Oliver wasn't just struggling with schoolwork, he was struggling with something much worse. I noticed it one afternoon when he came home with a torn sleeve and a fresh bruise on his arm, when he walked past me without a word and disappeared into his room. When I knocked and stepped inside, I found him sitting on his bed, sketchbook open in his lap, gripping his pencil so tightly that his knuckles were white. I asked him what had happened, asked him if he was okay, and he barely glanced at me before muttering that it was nothing, that it didn't matter, that it wasn't like I could do anything about it anyway. I sat on the edge of the bed, not pushing him, waiting for him to say something, and finally, after what felt like forever, he whispered that some kids at school had called him a charity case, that they had told him he didn't belong here, that he didn't have a real family, that I was just going to get tired of him like everyone else. I felt something inside me twist violently, an anger I hadn't expected burning through my chest, but I didn't let it show. I told him that they were wrong, that he did belong here, that I wasn't going to get tired of him, but he just let out a hollow laugh and said that's what people always said before they left. I didn't argue, didn't try to force him to believe me, because I knew words weren't enough, that he needed to see it, that he needed proof, and that night, I stayed up thinking about how I could give him that proof. I knew that the only thing that had ever made him feel safe was his art, that his sketchbook was the one thing he never let out of his sight, and I decided that if that was the thing that grounded him, then I was going to give him more of it. That weekend, while Laura took him out for the day, I turned the spare room into a home art studio. I bought shelves for his supplies, stocked up on sketchbooks, pencils, paints, and brushes, and even set up a drafting table and an easel. I framed some of his best sketches and hung them on the walls like they belonged in a gallery, because they did, because his talent deserved to be seen, because he deserved to know that his work, that he mattered. When he came home, I led him to the room, my heart pounding in my chest as I pushed open the door and watched him freeze in the doorway. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the space, his expression unreadable, and then, after a long moment, he turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper, and asked if it was really for him. I nodded, swallowing past the lump in my throat, and watched as he walked inside, his fingers brushing over the pencils, the paints, the canvas. Then, without warning, he dropped his sketchbook onto the desk and wrapped his arms around me in a quick, awkward hug, his voice muffled against my shoulder as he muttered a quiet, bare "thank you." It was the first time he had ever hugged me. The first time he had let his guard down even a little, and I held on to that moment with everything I had, knowing that this was the beginning of something real, something that neither of us had ever had before. The bullying didn't stop overnight, and Oliver still had moments where he struggled. Moments where he tested boundaries and waited for me to prove that I was staying, but slowly, he started to believe it. Slowly, he started to trust that he wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time since I had brought him home, I realized that I wasn't alone either. I had finally started to believe that Oliver and I were settling into something steady, something safe, something that finally felt like home, and even though there were still difficult days, I could see the changes in him. The way he no longer woke up expecting to pack his things, the way he no longer flinched at unexpected kindness, the way he was learning to trust that I wasn't going to leave, that he had a place where he belonged, that he had a home now. But just as I started to feel like we were making real progress, just as the weight of uncertainty began to ease, Ashley showed up out of nowhere and shattered the fragile sense of peace I had built for him. I hadn't seen or spoken to my sister in years, not since she lost Oliver to the system. Not since our parents washed their hands of her and moved on as if she had never existed, but now she was standing on my doorstep, thinner than I remembered, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, her face lined with exhaustion, her eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite place, a mixture of guilt, desperation, and maybe even hope, though I refused to believe it. I didn't let her in, didn't even consider it, instead stepping outside and closing the door firmly behind me, my pulse racing as I took in the sight of her, half of me wanting to yell, the other half wanting to demand why she had waited until now to come back, but I forced myself to stay calm as I spoke, my voice quiet but firm as I asked her why she was here. Ashley shoved her hands into the pockets of her worn-out jacket, her shoulders stiff, her gaze flickering to the side as she muttered that she had heard Oliver was with me, and when I asked how she knew, already suspecting the answer, she confirmed it without hesitation, telling me that our mother had told her everything. Of course, I thought bitterly. Of course, Margaret had suddenly decided to care about Ashley's existence now that it gave her another opportunity to tear me down, but I refused to let that anger distract me from the real issue. The fact that Ashley, the woman who had abandoned her son to the foster system, had suddenly decided to come back into his life after years of silence. I crossed my arms over my chest, keeping my tone as neutral as I could, though I could feel the rage simmering beneath the surface as I asked her why she was really here, why, after all this time, after missing so many years of his life, she had suddenly decided that she wanted to see him. She finally met my eyes then, and for the first time, I saw it clearly, the shame she was trying to hide, the regret that tightened her jaw as she told me that she had changed, that she had been sober for almost a year, that she had a job, a place to live, that she was trying to fix things, that she wanted to make things right. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that maybe she had turned her life around, but it was too little, too late, because Oliver wasn't just some loose end she could tie up to ease her own guilt, wasn't some piece of her past that she could reclaim now that she had decided she was ready. I told her, as calmly as I could, that he wasn't ready, that he had finally started to feel safe, that he had spent years learning not to trust the people who had let him down, and that I wasn't going to let her undo all the progress he had made just because she had suddenly decided she wanted to be his mother again. Ashley flinched at my words, her hands tightening into fists at her sides, her expression shifting from guilt to frustration as she shot back that he was her son, that she had a right to see him. But I didn't back down, didn't let the anger in her voice shake me, because the truth was that she had lost that right the moment she let him slip through her fingers without a fight. When I told her that she should have fought for him before now, she took a step back, her face pale, her mouth pressing into a thin line as she muttered that she wasn't giving up, that she would be back, and then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with my hands clenched into fists, my entire body tense with the weight of what had just happened. I wasn't going to tell Oliver, not yet, not when he had finally started to believe that his life wasn't about waiting for the next person to leave, but I knew it was only a matter of time before Ashley came back, before this became something I couldn't protect him from, and if that wasn't enough, my parents took it as their opportunity to attack me once again, twisting the situation into something they could use against me. Margaret called first, her voice sharp and cold, telling me that I was selfish for keeping Ashley away, that I was standing in the way of a mother trying to do the right thing, and when I snapped that the right thing would have been fighting for him when he needed her, she only scoffed, telling me that I had no right to make that decision, that I wasn't his real family. My father was next, his tone clipped and full of barely concealed disgust as he told me that I thought I knew what was best, but that I was just playing house, that I would never be Oliver's mother, that I would never be enough, and then finally Rachel called, throwing her usual venom into the mix, telling me that I had always wanted to be the hero, that I had always needed to prove I was better than everyone else, but that I had no idea what I was doing, that I was going to ruin Oliver's life, just as much as Ashley had. I didn't argue with her, didn't try to convince any of them that they were wrong, because I had finally realized that I didn't need their approval, didn't need their validation, didn't need their poisonous words in my life anymore. Because they had never cared about Oliver, had never once considered what was best for him, had never loved him the way they were pretending to now, and if I had to choose between them and him, then there was no choice to make, because I had already chosen Oliver a long time ago. The only thing that kept Oliver grounded through all of this was his art, the one thing that made sense to him when everything else felt uncertain, and when his school announced an art competition, I practically begged him to enter, but at first, he refused, claiming that it was stupid, that no one cared about his work, that it didn't matter, but I saw the way he kept looking at the flyer, the way his fingers twitched whenever he thought about it, the way he wanted to believe he was good enough, but was too afraid to take that risk. Eventually, I convinced him, and for weeks, he poured everything he had into his piece, sketching and erasing, muttering to himself about the details, the shading, the lighting, and when he finally let me see it, my breath caught in my throat, because it was a portrait of us. He had drawn me sitting on the couch reading, while he was on the floor with his sketchbook open, his face focused and serious, and it was simple, but it was us, and on the night of the competition, as we sat in the school auditorium, his hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt, his face carefully blank as he tried to hide how nervous he was, I watched as they called his name, watched as he froze, completely still, unable to believe what he had just heard, and when I nudged him forward, whispering that he needed to go up there, he finally moved, his steps slow and hesitant, like he thought it was some kind of mistake. But when he came back to his seat, trophy in hand, he whispered, "They liked it," and I smiled, squeezing his hand as I told him that they didn't just like it, they loved it, and for the first time in his life, I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, confidence. Ashley wasn't going to give up easily, and my family wasn't done trying to tear me down, but as I sat there, watching Oliver hold his trophy like it was the most important thing in the world, I realized that none of it mattered, because they weren't our family, they never had been, and they never would be, because we were.